On the Cameron Journal podcast, we are talking about Christian nationalism in the U.S. military, particularly at the U.S. Air Force Academy. And we're speaking with Brigadier General retired Martin France, who has written an article for thedailycost.com through the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, talking about a new case out of here in Washington, local news, Kennedy versus Bremerton Public Schools, about coaches praying and how that affects the work that MRFF does protecting our military servicemen and women from pressure to become evangelical Christians. So we're going to talk about how this might gut the establishment clause, how it might change things in the military. It's an interesting conversation. It's another in the content that I've done about Christian nationalism in the U.S. military. So this is a must listen to. It's national security. So it's a great conversation. He's very delightful to talk to. And let's get to it. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. Let's go. This is the Cameron Journal podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal podcast. Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, we are joined by retired Brigadier General Martin France, who was a faculty member at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. He is an engineer and has done development and invented all sorts of things that, I'm sure the Pentagon loves using in our various and sundry conflicts around the world. And we're not going to talk about things that explode or track people or anything like that. We're actually going to talk about something more insidious. We're going to talk about Christian nationalism in the Air Force Academy. Now, this is a topic that longtime followers of the podcast will know I have talked about a lot since it came to my attention in 2020, actually, I think. And so if you've been listening for a long time, you've heard me interview people like Mike Weinstein, who's head of the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. I've posted stuff on social media about this. When Rouges was still around, we ran a very long piece about the history of the organization, the history of Christian nationalism within the military, and particularly the U.S. Air Force Academy. And so there's a new threat on this horizon, kind of a new aspect of the story that we're talking about. And we are just excited to talk with the general today because we have this new sort of threat, this widening its way through the Supreme Court, called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. And it will change the constitutional interpretation of the Establishment Clause, which may include things like school prayer, and is going to adversely affect the experience of service members who are being pressured to not only just convert to Christianity, but specifically evangelical Christianity. So I'm not going to go into all that right now, but we are going to ask about the Supreme Court case. So welcome, General France, to the Cameron Journal podcast. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me, Cameron, and please call me Marty.
All right,
good
Marty.
to be here. Yep.
Yes. All right. So let's start from the beginning. So you posted a wonderful piece at dailycost.com this week about the Supreme Court case. Why don't we start from the beginning and get a grounding in this? Why don't you describe to us what the case entails and how it might change the Establishment Clause of the Constitution?
Sure. First off, I want to state that I'm not a lawyer, so anything that I say is really my interpretation of what I've read about the case from a variety of sources. So, the bottom line on this case is that there is an assistant football coach in Bremerton, Washington, at a high school there that decided that at some point that because of his faith, he would go out to the middle of the field on the 50-yard line at the end of every game and take a knee and pray. And over some time, members of the team would join him at the center of the field, and eventually even some members of opposing teams would do that, and it became quite a spectacle with a couple dozen or more players out in the middle of the field and maybe even full teams. The Bremerton School District, as I've read, asked him to not do that, that it was, they thought it was a violation of the Establishment Clause, since they are a government institution, and that the spectacle could be interpreted as either pressuring the students to participate in prayer or demonstrating some endorsement of his particular brand of religion by the district, since he is an employee of the district. They offered that he should. They offered him a place to pray privately, but he decided that he wanted to do it publicly, and so they decided at the end of the season. Now, he was on a one-year recurring contracts, and they had no obligation to rehire him. When he did not comply, they decided to terminate him at the end of the season. They didn't fire him in the middle of the season, and they maintained his salary, which was as an assistant football coach. He wasn't a teacher, so it was only $5,000 a year for the remainder of the year. So he got another year of salary, and he moved to Florida, but filed a lawsuit saying he was unjustly fired because of he saw it as his right to free practice of his religion. And this has made it all the way to the Supreme Court. He's lost every case along the way, but continued to appeal. And now it was presented and argued in front of the Supreme Court this past Monday. I'm sure there are many other details, and there are a variety of articles out there that can give you in-depth analysis beyond what I wrote. And I'll cite a couple of articles that I mentioned in the Washington Post and the New York Times. But that's really the background on the case. From my standpoint, I think it's.
Let's hold that thought for one moment. Let's hold that thought for one moment.
Yeah,
there's a couple things I want to clarify. I'm excited for the analysis. First of all, dear listeners, if you're a little rusty on your Constitution, let me remind you, when we talk about the Establishment Clause, we're talking about the First Amendment to the Constitution, which states Congress shall establish no religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. Congress shall pass no law establishing a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Let me quote that accurately. And that in the interpretation of that has been used to prevent government agencies from endorsing any specific religion, and most importantly was used in the 1950s to get rid of school prayer in schools, which until then was basically mandatory for students and was certainly allowed. And it was a landmark decision that came right off the back of school desegregation. It was like 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education.
Yeah, it was actually, I think it was 1962.
Yes.
And then there was a similar case argued in 1972 that up until 1972, even though in public schools, organized prayer conducted by teachers was not allowed, it was still allowed, and there was mandatory chapel attendance at our service academies, West Point, Annapolis, and the Air Force Academy. And that was overturned in 1972. So up until 1972, our military service academies in the U.S. had mandatory chapel services, surprisingly.
Yes, and which is kind of pretty obviously, is a kind of establishment. Now, obviously, that does not preclude student-led prayer groups, which exist, or private places for students to pray. School
Right.
districts here in the Seattle area have them for our Muslim population. There's
Mhm.
even in the airport at SeaTac, there is a room for Muslims to go and pray, or anybody. It's non-denominational. It's just a
Right.
little area you can go, but Muslim people tend to use it the most.
Mhm.
So that makes sense. And it's the one of the interesting parts about this case is, for me, I'm actually in Seattle, so this is local news
Right. Yeah.
for me. Um, and I'm not surprised that Bremerton took that action. We're pretty liberal blue here in Washington, especially on this side of the Cascades.
Yeah.
So it's not too surprising that people would be kind of like, that's not so, not, we have the most concentration of atheists in the nation in the greater Puget Sound area. So
Okay.
I totally understand the social dynamics of all of that. So I I understand that as well. But I just wanted to remind the listener about what we're talking about constitutionally. That's the language. And then so getting into your analysis you were about to jump into, though, what makes this dangerous for our service members and the service academies? Walk us through that.
Okay. So the interesting part here is that, there's always been this sort of balance between free practice and the establishment clause. And in the military, there's really been guarantees of free practice because in all of the military services, we have active duty chaplains that allow and facilitate religious practice by members of the military. But the issue with the military, and you see this also in schools, and the reason why there are prohibitions against prayer in schools is that you've got a hierarchical relationship. If we look at a football team, what a head coach says and how he or she judges members of the team can impact whether a player plays, whether they are even on the team. They hold power that can be ultimately play a role in whether a kid gets a scholarship to college by giving them access to playing on teams at a school. And so when a coach at a school begins praying in the middle of the 50-yard line, and other players, maybe players in leadership positions like team captains, go out and join the coach in prayer, then because of the leadership position of the coach and maybe of some leader student athletes on the team, other players feel pressured to participate, whether they believe as such or not. So they feel like, hey, to be part of the team and to be accepted and for the coach to like me, I might have to go out there, and whether I'm praying or just faking it on one knee, I've got to participate in this ritual. And there's pressure in that sense. That's why in 1962 that the teacher-led school prayer was banned, because teachers were in a leadership position. They had authority over students. And that, when someone is praying from an authoritative position, that becomes an establishment issue. You are a government agency with those that you are paying to lead that organization, and they are endorsing a particular religious perspective. So if you look at that from the school standpoint, and again, they've won every case up until now against Coach Kennedy, they've made a strong case that the pressure this coach and the peer pressure by the players applied to others constitutes endorsement of religion, which violates the establishment clause. Now, if you take that same situation of a coach getting paid only $5,000 a year, who's an assistant coach, not a head coach, and you see that they've won those cases against him up until now, and now let's move into the professional environment of a military organization,
Where the pressure is even worse. Yes.
Exactly. Where everyone has a rank, everyone has a position within the organization, everyone is being evaluated by leaders. There are annual reports written. Everyone is being judged on whether their shoes are shined, not just how they do their job, but how they look in uniform, and how well their shoes are shined, and how professional their demeanor, how they speak, how they look, all these things are part of the military life, the regimentation, the structure, the ceremony, all of those things become part of your job and part of your life. And you're in a position where your boss or your boss's boss has enormous authority and impact over your life. They're the ones that decide what your next assignments are. They're the ones that recommend you for promotion. They're the ones that decide whether if you can re-enlist or whether you can continue to serve up until retirement or beyond. So there's the hierarchy in the military is like you'd see on a football team at a high school, only amped up about 2 orders of magnitude and, pardon the pun, kind of on steroids. So it concerns me greatly because I've been in situations where it's been clear that the boss, the commander, has a particular religious perspective, and they will evaluate, unfortunately, they'll evaluate some of their subordinates based on whether they are part of the same group. In other words, are they going to church on Sunday? Are they going to Bible study off duty or at lunchtime in the office? I've seen commanders hold before staff meetings, have silent moments of prayer or active moments of prayer. I've been in situations where commanders are saying, okay, now let us, after the national anthem, now let us pray. Which in each of these cases is part of that spectacle that Coach Kennedy and Bremerton exercised with the football team. But now that's part of a military unit's daily activities. And in most cases, you don't have the option to not participate. Or if you chose not to participate, you would be calling yourself out as someone who is not part of the team, not on the same belief system as the commander. And that can ruin your career.
Yes, and that aspect of it, I think, is what is the most dangerous and unfair portion. And
Right.
it's important to remind people there was a very specific reason why the founders were afraid of established religions. When our country was founded, every European country had one.
Right. Exactly.
There are several that still do. Denmark, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, all this sort of thing. That have this kind of merging of state and religion, and the founders they were not interested in having that in this country. And so we've had this, although it's not codified in law, we've certainly had the spirit of it being this idea of separation of church and state. This case obviously is an attack on that, not only for children in school and all this type of thing, but whatever it affects MRFF's work is, should the Supreme Court decide that Coach Kennedy was really in the right, it could really endanger the work of MRFF. Or am I reading that wrong?
Well, no, you're reading it correctly. And it's not endangering the work of the MRFF so much as it is endangering the rights of any government employee or, frankly, any citizen that comes into contact with the government. So, let me give you a couple other examples. Let's say that the Supreme Court rules that Coach Kennedy had the right to go out and pray because it was an optional activity, and the students weren't obligated to go out and pray with him. They just chose to. So let's take that same example and let's put it into a military organization and say, well, the commander says, well, before our exercise this afternoon, I'm going to hold a 10-minute optional prayer service and Bible study, and anyone who'd like to join me is welcome to, but it's purely optional. And suddenly you realize that, well, gosh, this is something that's important to the commander, and you
might gain advantage by doing it in all those promotions and assignments and things. Yes.
Right. Or I might notice that the people that are going to the the boss's Bible study are suddenly getting better evaluations or winning more awards or getting promotions. And so now, hey, I've got to participate in the boss's Bible study, regardless of whether I'm, what my religious belief is. I think about it in terms of the Air Force Academy and the incursion of religion into the classroom or the training environment there, where it really has no place. And kind of hang with me here for an example. Let's say, we have a 10-minute break between classes at the Air Force Academy. Mm-hmm. Let's say a professor says, for any of you that would like to arrive at class 5 minutes early, I'm going to have a short 5-minute totally optional prayer session where I'm going to pray for your, good fortune in my class and pray for, God's assistance for you in our class. But it's totally optional. Well, sure, that's free time and that's not class time, but that means that any cadet that comes in 5 minutes early is going to have to sit through a prayer service led by the person that's grading their tests and deciding whether they pass the class. Or if I stand outside the classroom, then I'm demonstrating to the professor that I don't believe like he or she does, and wondering if he or she is going to judge me on that basis, or they're really going to just judge me and grade me based on how I perform in the class. And I think would be very similar to the case we see with Kennedy. You can think of lots of other examples of where you interact with the government. There are stories that the MRFF has dealt with in the Department of Veterans Affairs where veterans go in for counseling and their counselor asks them their religious beliefs and asks them if they want to commit their life to Jesus Christ or something like that, which is totally out of line.
And we won't even get into like religious displays on government property. That was the huge MRFF thing that we covered on the blog, all this type of thing. I mean, it's just everywhere. It's becoming a pervasive culture within the whole military. And I think that's what most people don't understand. But my question is, like, if this case goes through and is decided, perhaps not the way you'd like it to go, will it make the work of MRFF more difficult? Like, will the argument that these things shouldn't be taking place be more difficult? And how might that affect the effectiveness of the organization?
Yeah, well, I think what it would do is, I think it would take a step towards invalidating or reversing the 1962 public prayer decision. School prayer decision, because while they might hold that a teacher can't lead the students in prayer, it would affirm that teachers, coaches, leaders can hold what they, air quotes, call an optional event that really isn't necessarily all that optional and runs the risk of demonstrating religious bias in a government organization.
Right. And and to me, that's what is so, for me personally, so concerning about this is when and if you look at the history of Europe, this was very common before the 18th century. If you wanted a government position and you wanted to, or go a high rank in the military, you had to, tick several boxes. And one of them was, believing in the right religion. We all remember the wars of religion.
Right.
And if you wanted an officer and you were in a small, country and you were, the minority religion, it would be, virtually impossible for you to advance because you didn't believe in the state religion. So this is Catholic Protestant, this is Jewish Christian, there's all these kind of these dyads out there where this has affected people. And we have such a long tradition in this country of there not being a religious test. And that's also in the Constitution. We have this tradition of keeping these things separate, and now it seems like they're about to merge back together. And I think that's genuinely concerning.
Well, I think
it's not the best people, just the people that believe the right thing.
Yeah, I think there's, for a long time in the United States, we had the rules in place in the Constitution, and in many cases, they weren't necessarily honored. I mean, remember, we didn't do away with school prayer till 1962. The issue was that really until the 40s, 50s, 60s with the civil rights movement and several other rights movements, not just related to race, but women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, etc. The people making decisions were generally Protestant white males, and you did have to more or less conform to their vision of the nation. And so you saw exceptions, but they were exceptions. There were Jews in the military. There were, very few black officers coming out of West Point, Benny Davis and others in the 20s and the 30s, but they were rare exceptions. And so I think what's really happened here is that in the last 60 or 70 or 80 years, there have been challenges to the status quo that have asked the question about why aren't we enforcing our Constitution, and why aren't we enforcing the Establishment Clause? And those sort of arguments are what gave us Brown versus Board of Education. They're what did away with school prayer in 1962. Those demands are what enabled us to eliminate mandatory chapel at the service academies in 1972. So I see it more as going back to a status quo that was in many cases just as unconstitutional as Jim Crow laws in the South.
Yes, and I think the part that kind of concerns me, and when we were doing our pre-production talk, I was talking about, this is a national security concern.
Yeah.
Because here in America, we sleep easier at night knowing, when it comes to national defense, the best people are on the job. And there's people at NORAD who are keeping an eye on Mr. Putin and his missiles. And, and we have people that are keeping track of terrorists, and it's not the people that believe the right religion or subscribe to the right thing. It's just the best people who know how to track these folks down.
Right.
And it seems to me that what MRFF has actively fought against, what I uncovered when I discovered this whole problem, is that this is starting to amount to a religious test. I mean, if we're promoting people based upon your proximity to a certain religion, one, that's basically a religious test. And two, I sleep less easy being like, it's not the best people at the Pentagon. It's just the evangelical Christians at the Pentagon. And there's some poor soul who might be able to do a smash up job, but doesn't believe the right religion. And they're stuck in, I don't know, Nebraska or something.
Right. Yeah,
I don't know about you. That would keep me up at night, especially when Russia's invading Ukraine right now and all that sort of thing. I want the best people on the job, not the people who believe the right thing.
Right. And that's something that worries us too. What we also don't want is we don't want people in the military who, when they decide to be in the military and they are trained and educated to perform in the military, we all take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And there's nothing in our oath about affirming any particular religion. What worries me would be people within the military that place their religious belief above their duty to the Constitution and their oath they've taken to support and defend the Constitution. So, for example, if one religious leader or another were to tell them, no, you're not going to perform that duty, or you're not going to be loyal to your unit, you need to be loyal to your religion, that would be essentially violating their oath to defend the Constitution. And so what concerns me in many cases is that we would have a religious perspective or religious leaders that might have more authority over our military than our constitutionally elected leaders. Again, when we
and not only so now the problems are piling up. We have a national security problem, we have a constitutional problem, and we have a existential future threat to the country problem.
Right. And
That's
really this comes
should give one pause
from
given January
violations of the
6th,
Establishment Clause.
2021. Like
Yeah.
that should all give us a great deal of pause.
Right. I mean, and you see that because some of this hardcore religious nationalism clearly carries over into the political realm as well. That's why you had such an enormous number of the January 6th insurrectionists were evangelical Christians who conflated their religious belief with a particular political belief. And you see that same sort of thing within the military that view their religious perspective mixed with very hardcore conservative beliefs that, in my mind, threaten what should be the impartiality of our military, the non-political or non-partisan nature of our military. Throughout my career, I always made it a point to be as neutral as I could. I told my faculty, and I wrote this in my article, when I was a department head, I always told my faculty that at the end of the semester, their students or their cadets should have no more idea who they voted for than what they do on a Sunday morning or a Friday evening or a Saturday or in any religious practice, any more than they should have any idea what you do behind your bedroom door in the privacy of your own home. That is not part of our job. That's not how we should evaluate our cadets. That's not anything that is part of the persona we should present. That's not our job. So don't go there. And
well, I think that's the troubling part is I think we in the public have sort of taken the non-political nature of the military for granted.
Yes, exactly.
And because we kind of always presume the military assiduously stays out of politics, we kind of rely upon that so we don't end up like Thailand or Brazil or Argentina or most of Central America or parts of Africa, where the military ultimately becomes a huge political deciding force.
Right.
And you have places like Thailand where if the military doesn't like who gets elected, they just put them out and have a military hunter for 10 years. And we've not had that in this country in 230 years, but now it seems like we have that possibility now. You get too many of these folks in high leadership positions in the Pentagon, and all of a sudden the political opinions of DOD suddenly matter in American politics. Again, that will keep us up at night.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or it should.
And that's what keeps us awake at night. I will tell you, I think that the vast majority in the military, I think a large majority still would like to keep everyone as nonpartisan as possible. I've got strong faith in most, but not all of our leaders that I know personally. But, when we look back, we do have a long and very solid history of nonpartisan military because we remember the exceptions when that wasn't the case. And in most cases, they were fired. When MacArthur got political with Truman in the Korean War, he was fired. We know of others that have been fired over the years because they were overtly partisan. And so that's a precedent that's important. And you're right in saying that it's something that we need to preserve and right now is under threat, in particular by hardcore Christian nationalists within the military who view their role differently.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that I think is most concerning is like when I first started looking into this, a year, 2 years ago, I was kind of like, okay, well, maybe this is just an Air Force problem and we just need to throw out the bad apples and clean the things up. And then as I read more press releases and talked with the organization more and all this type of thing, it's like, oh no, this is a cancer that has spread throughout. And it's been so many years now that a lot of these people are in leadership positions. Yeah. And when you look at how politics are in this country, I mean, even on January 6th, I had readers being like, well, when does the military step in? I'm like, well, this is a political problem. If they do their jobs, they're really not supposed to. But we're now at a position in this country where we have to have those types of conversations. And that
Right.
I think is concerning. And when you think about it from a Christian nationalist perspective, well, we kind of know where they're going to fall on the political spectrum.
Yeah.
Again, that's
Sadly, we do.
something that should be keeping us up at night.
Right.
You know, it's
And
a very
it's
difficult
something
thing.
that the military. It's a challenge for the military because the military tends to attract those that are service oriented and also conservative. And so there are more conservative members of the military. That's true probably in the military, military all around the world in every country. But as you've mentioned several times, we have constitutional guarantees that should keep our military, even if it is more conservative than the rest of society, still in service to the Constitution and society and not serving another master outside of the Constitution. I am afraid that if the Kennedy versus Bremerton SCOTUS ruling goes the other way, that will take us another step down the path towards a more partisan, more religious military, overtly religious military, that now allows even more recruitment. And, frankly, the term the Republicans, many Republicans decry right now in public schools is grooming. But
Yeah.
that's exactly what would happen in our military if we were to allow the Establishment Clause to be eroded and we allowed senior officers and enlisted to essentially groom new entrants into the military to fit their religious perspective.
Well, and yes, and I think, on the face of it, a lot of people might look at it and say, well, is it so bad that people are spreading their faith in the military and all this type of thing? And, and people are young and maybe looking for answers and, shouldn't they be allowed to do that sort of thing? And I say, well, that might seem like that, but, does corporate America tolerate that? I've worked in corporate America and I'll tell you, no, that's a fast way to get fired at pretty much every
not
major.
unless you're in an organization that overtly supports that sort of thing, like you're, a Chick-fil-A or a
Hobby Lobby.
Hobby Lobby or Chick-fil-A, or, and and you know what, they're private companies and they can do that. But other companies that have much more diverse employee bases know
Right.
that that's a recipe for disaster. And
A lot of
right.
lawsuits and a lot of expensive lawyers.
Right.
Absolutely. And then that's like, there's things where that's kind of okay. And it's a private organization. They can do what they want. But I tell you, try that stuff at any of the Fortune 500 and you'll, to borrow a term, you'll get drummed out the core. So,
Absolutely.
And that's even true, when you get into academia, and academia is a situation where the vast majority are non-religious, that's the majority in academia. So when people start going around and doing that, it makes people really uncomfortable. And that's, I think, the thing people are really overlooking in all of this. It's uncomfortable for those high school students that the coach Kennedy was coaching to feel that sort of pressure. And it's even worse for a young academy cadet at the Air Force Academy or Annapolis or West Point to feel that type of pressure, or that their whole military career, and keep in mind, you have to get a congressman to get appointed to these places. So you don't want to lose that because it wasn't easy to get in there. Right. To feel that pressure as well. That's really terribly unfair. And it's the sad, and I think the sad thing is these Christian nationalists don't just go, it's not just any type of Christian, it's their specific brand. They go after Catholics. Half of MRFF's clients are people of other denominations.
Right. Yeah. Well,
not just
atheists.
Think there's Catholics that are kind of like, I just want to be Catholic over here and they're not letting me.
And, and I think another thing that people don't understand, and this comes from, and Mikey and I have talked about this several times, is just a complete lack of empathy. In other words, an inability to see the other side of this. And what I mean by that is, if I've got a faculty member, there are several people that wouldn't think it's any big deal at all for a faculty member to tell his or her cadets at the Air Force Academy, well, in addition to studying, I recommend that you spend your Sunday morning at church and that you devote your life to Jesus Christ and pray for his assistance. And someone could say that in class, and I'll bet a majority of the country would say, well, that's not so bad. On the other hand, what if I, as an atheist, walked into class and said, okay, well, we got a big test coming up on Monday. How many of you are going to church on Sunday? And several raised their hands. And I said, well, I think that's probably a waste of time, because I consider religion the opiate of the masses, and you're better off studying your engineering. Now, I don't see any difference between what I would say there and what the other professor would say, but I'd be fired in a heartbeat, and excuses would be made for the other professor. All we're saying is that issue just simply shouldn't come up. If it does, you've made a mistake. Whether you're Christian or atheist or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist, it doesn't matter. You're in a classroom. The religion of the professor and the students should not play a role. And if you're on a football team in Bremerton, Washington, your religion and the coach's religion should not play a role. It's a public school.
Right. And I think people don't understand how much pushback there can be within the organization. One of the things that was cited in the original presser from MRFF was a 2012 article about a counterinsurgency investigation that the dean of faculty conducted at the Air Force Academy to find out who was leaking to MRFF. Right. This is reaching levels of insanity that is concerning. Yep. From someone who is on the inside, what is that? What's that like? What's that pressure like? What's it like inside the walls, for people? How bad has it gotten, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, what happens in those situations is the unit or the organization fails to function properly because you don't have trust in your leadership. You don't have trust in some of your peers because they are judging you based on your religious beliefs, not on your job performance. And so any organization that loses the trust of the leadership or whose senior leaders do not trust each other ends up being non-functional and being a problem. And that's why injecting religion from any perspective into a military organization is not good for morale, and good order and discipline is how we put it. And that's why the MRFF fights the battles they do, is because they want our military to be as effective as possible. They want our military to function with good morale and good order and discipline. And they know that the quickest way to destroy that is to inject partisanship within a unit, especially religious partisanship.
Well, yes, and we've seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine what happens when a military organization completely breaks down. You end up with the convoy 2 miles long sitting on a road, just to sit there to look at, sort of thing. Yeah. And, we don't want, if we are put in a situation where we have to defend the country, we don't want that to be us. Right. We're just, it's like, that's a lovely M1 Abrams sitting there. Someone's blown it up and it's now decorative.
Or some farmer's carting it into his field, right?
Right, exactly, sort of thing. So this is quite concerning. So I imagine we're not going to find out the outcome of Kennedy versus Bremerton until the
probably late summer
decisions in June. End of term. End of term. So we'll keep updated at that time and perhaps have you back to talk about the decision at that time.
Okay, well, I hope it's a happy meeting then.
Yes, I do too. I hope that it would have to be kind of like the Supreme Court has upheld establishment rather than a more dour talk where we have to talk about the other alternative. We're not going to
Right.
speak that into existence right now. So,
Right. Okay.
yes. So let's have our final thoughts on this and let people know where they can. Normally, we would do plugs. I don't suppose people need to find you online. I don't know why I'm saying that. It's force a
Yeah.
habit. But let's give us some final thoughts on this and what the final takeaway is for people.
And I spent over 41 years in uniform, 37 of those on active duty. And my decision to do so was motivated in large part by my desire to, as I took my oath, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I think it's an extremely well-written document that's stood up over the centuries. And I don't want to see what I think is one of the most fundamental parts of that document eviscerated by a Supreme Court, because the implications in the long term are so dire to so many parts of our society, to our military, to our government. And when I say government, I mean government from the president all the way down to your local school board, and yes, even a high school football coach. Our public schools are one of the most fundamental and important parts of our taxpayer-funded government. I don't want to see religion re-injected there, and I don't want to see it reinforced and re-injected in our military either. So I'm hoping everything comes out well, and we'll check back in June or July, and we'll talk to you then.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. And if you want to learn more about the case and more about Marty, please visit mrff.org. That's the best place for that. Or you can read my very long piece that I wrote on medium.com. I'll link that in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming by the Cameron Journal podcast.
I appreciate it, Cameron. I'll look forward to talking to you again in the future, and thanks for giving me the time.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.